I remember the exact moment my world ended. It was a Tuesday, February the 11th, 4 years ago. I was sitting in my old recliner chair, the brown one with the torn armrest that my wife, Eleanor, always said she was going to replace, and I was drinking my second cup of coffee. The morning news was on, nothing special, just another quiet morning in a quiet house. Then my phone rang. It was my daughter-in-law Sandra, Michael's wife, and the second I heard her voice I knew. I don't know how I knew. Maybe it's something that happens to fathers, some invisible thread that connects you to your child, even when they're grown. Even when they're 34 years old and living their own life 3 states away. Her voice was just one word. Thomas, just my name, nothing else. And I dropped my coffee cup. It shattered on the kitchen floor, and I didn't even look down. I just stood there, gripping the phone, and I said, Sandra, where is he? She told me Michael had gone on a ski trip to the mountains in Colorado with 3 of his friends. They'd been planning it for months, a boys' weekend, something they did every winter. She wasn't worried at first when he didn't call Friday night, because Michael was always bad with his phone on those trips. Too busy having fun, too busy being young and alive and happy. But by Saturday morning, his friends had come back to the cabin without him. They said he'd gone out for an early morning run on the mountain trails, before sunrise, alone, and he never came back. The search and rescue teams found his jacket, his water bottle, one of his gloves, but they did not find Michael. My son, my only son, had vanished into the Colorado mountains like smoke into cold air. And that morning, standing in my kitchen with coffee soaking into my socks, I aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Let me tell you a little about myself, so you understand why what happened later hurt as much as it did. My name is Thomas Gerald Whitmore. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a maintenance supervisor at a paper mill in rural Pennsylvania. Not a glamorous job, not a job that made me rich, but it was honest work, and I was proud of it. My wife Eleanor and I got married in 1981. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, not in a movie, star way, but in the way that a warm kitchen feels beautiful on a cold night. She had dark eyes and a laugh that filled a room. We had 2 sons. Michael was the older one, born 1989. He grew up to be everything I hoped for, tall, kind, hardworking. He became a civil engineer, married Sandra in 2016. They had a little boy together, my grandson, Oliver. Oliver was 3 years old when his father disappeared. Then there was Daniel, my younger son, and Daniel. Daniel is a different story, one I'll get to. Eleanor passed away from cancer in 2019. 6 months before Michael disappeared. I tell you this because you need to understand what losing Michael did to a man who had already lost his wife. There are no words for that kind of empty. It's like your chest becomes a hollow room where the wind just blows through. After Eleanor died, the family started to pull apart. Grief does that sometimes. Instead of bringing people together, it sends them in all directions, like broken pieces of glass rolling across a hard floor. Sandra, my daughter-in-law, was wonderful at first. She called every day. She brought Oliver over on weekends. We would sit together and look at pictures of Eleanor, and sometimes we would cry, and sometimes we would laugh, and it helped. But then Michael disappeared, and everything changed. After Michael vanished, I did what any father would do. I went to Colorado. I drove 17 hours straight. I didn't sleep. I barely stopped. I just drove, gripping that steering wheel like if I let go, I would fall apart completely. When I arrived, I met with the search and rescue coordinator, a serious woman named Captain Diane Reyes. She was kind, but honest. She told me that the mountain terrain where Michael had gone running was brutal, rocky, remote, that a person could fall into a ravine or get disoriented in the tree line and walk for miles in the wrong direction. She said they were doing everything they could. Everything wasn't enough. After 2 weeks, The official search was suspended. They hadn't found a body. They hadn't found any more signs of him. They said it didn't mean he was definitely dead. But they also couldn't justify the cost and the manpower indefinitely. There were other emergencies. Other families, my family. I stayed in Colorado for 3 months. I rented a small cabin outside of Breckenridge. I hired a private investigator, a man named Roy Castillo, with every dollar of savings I had. I walked the trails myself every morning with a flashlight and a photograph of Michael in my pocket. I talked to locals. I talked to hikers. I put up flyers on every post and bulletin board from the ski resort to the next town over. People were kind, mostly. They would nod and say they were praying for us. Some of them recognized Michael's photo and said yes. They'd seen him before, in the coffee shop, at the trailhead, laughing with his friends, but nobody had seen him that morning. When I finally came back to Pennsylvania, I was a different man. My savings were mostly gone. My house needed repairs I couldn't afford. I sold Eleanor's car to pay Roy Castillo for another few months of searching. Roy found nothing. I went back to Colorado twice more over the next 2 years. Each time, I came back empty. During all of this, and this is the part that started to break my heart in a different way, my family began to drift away from me. Sandra stopped bringing Oliver over. At first she said it was because the drive was hard. Then she stopped answering my calls as quickly. Then she started only responding to texts, and even those became shorter, more distant, more polite in the way that strangers are polite. I understood she was in pain. I never blamed her. But I was in pain too. Oliver was my only connection to Michael, and watching that connection thin out like old rope made something inside me quietly unravel. My brother, Gerald, we called him Jerry, had cut contact with me years earlier. That's its own story, a story about money and pride and old arguments that never got resolved. We hadn't spoken in 11 years by the time Michael disappeared. I had invited him to Eleanor's funeral. He didn't come. I'd given up on that relationship a long time ago. And so I was alone, 65 years old, retired, living in a house full of photographs, searching for a son the world had mostly decided was dead. But I never decided that. I want you to understand something. When you are a father, a real father, the kind who drove your son to baseball practice and sat with him when he had nightmares and watched him walk across the stage at his college graduation, you don't just accept a missing body as a missing person. You can't. It's not weakness. It's just love. It's the most stubborn, relentless, unconditional thing a human heart is capable of. I knew Michael was out there. I just didn't know where. Now I need to tell you about the part that still keeps me up some nights. About 18 months after Michael disappeared, Sandra started seeing someone. I found out through a mutual friend, a woman who used to come to our church. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "Thomas, I don't know if you've heard." In that voice people use when they're about to tell you something they think might destroy you. His name was Derek. He was a software developer. Good. Looking, apparently, young. He started coming around, taking Sandra to dinner, spending time with Oliver. I didn't say a word to Sandra about it. I know how that sounds. But who was I to judge? She was 30, 2 years old. Michael had been missing for a year and a half. The courts had not declared him legally dead, not yet. But Sandra was still a living person with a living life to manage. She had a 3-year-old, she had bills, she had loneliness that I understood better than anyone, so I stayed silent. I kept calling, I kept sending birthday cards for Oliver, I kept asking if I could visit. Then Derek started answering Sandra's phone. The first time it happened, I thought I'd dialed wrong. I apologized and hung up. The second time, a few weeks later, he answered again and said in this flat, polite voice, "Sandra's busy right now. I'll tell her you called." I said, Thank you. Please tell her it's Thomas, Michael's father. There was a pause. Then Derek said, I know who you are. And the line went quiet. Sandra called me back an hour later. She sounded tired and a little irritated, like I'd somehow inconvenienced her. Thomas, she said, not Dad, which she used to call me Thomas. I know this is hard, but Oliver needs stability. He needs routine. And every time you come over or talk about Michael, it upsets him. I said, he's my grandson, Sandra. He's all I have left of my son. There was a long silence. Then she said something I will never forget. She said, Michael's been gone for almost 2 years, Thomas. At some point, we all have to start living again. I didn't answer her. I sat there in my chair, the same brown recliner, and I held the phone against my ear long after she hung up. Outside, it was raining. I could hear it against the window. And I thought about Michael as a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on my lap in this same chair, watching football, eating popcorn, asking me questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? How far away is the moon? Dad, do you think I'll be tall when I grow up? I never answered Sandra. I just let the rain keep falling. Then came Daniel. My younger son, Daniel Whitmore, was 40 years old and had spent most of his adult life making decisions I didn't fully understand. Not bad decisions exactly, just different from mine. Daniel had moved to Phoenix when he was 26. He'd done well for himself in real estate. He drove a nice truck. He wore clothes that looked like they cost what I used to make in a week. He and I had never been close the way Michael and I were close, but we got along. We talked at Christmas. He came to Eleanor's funeral, which I was grateful for. After Michael disappeared, Daniel called me a few times. He sounded sympathetic. He sent a card. Once, he sent a check, not a small one, and told me to use it for the search expenses. I was grateful for that too. I called him and thanked him, and he said, It's nothing, Dad, family. But then, slowly, the calls became less frequent. And the last time I saw Daniel in person was at Eleanor's memorial 1-year anniversary dinner, which Sandra had organized at a restaurant. Daniel had driven up from Philadelphia, where he'd been on a business trip. We sat across from each other at dinner, and he kept checking his phone. He was pleasant enough. He asked me how I was doing. I told him the truth, that I wasn't doing well, that Roy had hit another dead end, that I was thinking of going back to Colorado in the spring. Daniel put down his fork. He looked at me with this expression I recognized. It was the same expression he used to give me when he thought I was being unreasonable. Even as a boy, a kind of patient, tired pity, he said, Dad, you need to be realistic. I said, What does that mean? He said, It means that Michael's been gone for over a year. It means you've spent most of your savings. It means you're living alone in that house, not eating right, driving yourself crazy over something you can't control. He paused. Michael would not want this for you. I said, very quietly, You don't know what Michael would want. Daniel looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her plate. Daniel said, Dad, I love you, but at some point you have to accept. No, I said. Just that one word. No. And Daniel sat back and sighed and said, Okay, Dad, in the voice of a man who had already decided the conversation was over. I paid for my own dinner that night. I drove home alone, and I didn't hear from Daniel for 4 months after that. Let me tell you about the day everything changed. It was a Thursday, October, 4 years after Michael vanished. I had spent the previous 6 weeks at a small rental cabin I'd found outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I went there sometimes to think. It was cheap, it was quiet, and the owner, an old woman named Mrs. Parrish, was kind enough to give me a discount because she knew my situation. I had told her about Michael once, and she had listened without interrupting, which was more than most people did. I was sitting on the porch of that cabin in the late afternoon, drinking tea, watching the mountain tree line. I had a photograph of Michael in my hand. I carried it everywhere. It was from his wedding day. He was laughing at something off camera, his head thrown back, his arm around Sandra. He looked so alive in that photo that sometimes looking at it felt like pressing on a bruise. I heard tires on the gravel road before I saw the car. A black Mercedes, new, the kind of car that announces itself. It pulled up slow, like the driver wasn't sure he had the right place. Then the door opened, and I saw my brother Jerry for the first time in 11 years. He was heavier than I remembered. His hair had gone fully white. He was wearing a gray jacket and dark pants, and he looked like he'd driven a long way. There was something tired and urgent in his eyes all at once. He stood by the car and looked at me on the porch. I didn't say anything. He said, "Thomas." I said, "Gerald." Another silence. Then he said the words that stopped my heart. "Get in the car, Thomas. I know where Michael is. I want you to stay with me here." Because what I'm about to tell you, I had to hear it twice before my brain would accept it. I stood up from that porch chair so fast I knocked my tea off the railing. I walked down the steps and stood in front of my brother, and I grabbed him by the jacket. I, Thomas Gerald Whitmore, a man who had not raised his hand to anyone since 1987, and I said, "What did you just say to me?" Jerry didn't flinch. He just looked at me with those old tired eyes and said, "He's alive, Thomas. Michael is alive." The world tilted. I let go of his jacket. I stepped back. My legs felt like they were made of wet paper. "How?" I said. Not a question, more like a sound, like air leaving a body. Jerry took a breath. He said, "I need you to sit down. Tell me, Thomas, tell me right now, Gerald." And so he did. He told me that 3 months after Michael disappeared on that mountain, Jerry had received a phone call from a man named Paul Acaffer, a man who ran a small wilderness therapy retreat in a remote part of Montana. Paul Acaffer had found a man wandering near his property in early March, barely coherent, suffering from severe hypothermia, a head injury, and what doctors later determined was a form of trauma-induced dissociative amnesia. The man didn't know his name. He didn't know where he was from. He didn't remember anything about his life before waking up in a hospital bed in a small Montana town. The hospital had tried to identify him. They ran his fingerprints. At the time, this is the part that made me sink to the gravel on my knees. At the time, Michael's fingerprints were not in any law enforcement database. He was a civil engineer, not a criminal. The National Missing Persons Alert was in the system, but there was a clerical error. His case had been filed under a wrong date, making the database search miss the match. Paul Acaffer named the man John. John lived at the retreat for nearly a year, slowly recovering. He did physical labor. He spent time in nature. He was quiet and cooperative, but there was something behind his eyes that Paul described as a locked room. Like someone was in there, behind a closed door, and couldn't find the handle. Then one day, almost 2 years after Michael disappeared, John saw a photograph. It was a photograph that Jerry had sent to Paul Acaffer. Jerry, who was on the board of a wilderness therapy nonprofit organization, had seen Paul at a conference and heard the story of John. And something, some instinct, some blood memory made Jerry ask to see a photograph. He had sent Paul a photograph of our family, a Christmas photo from 2017. Michael, Sandra, Oliver, Eleanor, me, all of us around the tree. When John saw that photograph, he sat down on the floor of Paul's office and cried for 45 minutes. He didn't know why, but his hands were shaking, and he kept touching the photograph, and he kept saying one word over and over. Oliver, 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 his son's name, and that locked door, that closed room in Michael's memory, began very slowly to open. Here is where I had to sit down on the gravel because my legs truly gave out. Jerry had known for almost 2 years. 2 years I looked up at my brother from the ground, and I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He sat down on the porch step. He put his hands between his knees like a man confessing in church. He said, "Because Michael asked me not to." The words hit me like a wall of ice water. Jerry explained it carefully. When Michael began recovering his memory, it happened in fragments. Pieces coming back over weeks and months. He remembered his childhood first, then college, then Eleanor. He remembered me, he remembered Daniel, but he also remembered other things I didn't know. Michael had gone out that morning on the mountain alone for a reason. Not just for exercise. He had gone because he and Sandra had fought the night before. A serious fight. The kind that makes a person need cold air and empty space to think. He had not told his friends how bad the argument was. He had just said he was going for a run and walked out into the dark before dawn. He fell into a rocky ravine in the dark. He hit his head on the way down. He survived barely because a steep snowbank at the bottom slowed his fall. He crawled for almost a day before Paul Acker's people found him. Now, as his memory returned, Michael was also remembering the marriage, the cracks in it, the arguments, the distance. He was remembering that Sandra had been pulling away long before that ski trip. He was remembering conversations I had never heard about, fights I was never told about, and Michael, my son, my stubborn, proud son, was scared. He was scared that if he came back, Sandra would be gone, that the life he'd been fighting his way back to, in his mind, would be gone, that Oliver wouldn't know him, that everyone had already moved on, and he would come home a ghost to people who had buried him and kept living. He told Jerry all of this, and Jerry, God help him, had promised to give Michael time. I sat there in that gravel, and I didn't speak for a long time. Finally I said, "Is he ready now?" Jerry looked at me. His eyes were wet. He said, "He called me last week. He said he wants to see you, Thomas, just you, before anyone else." I said, "Take me to my son." We drove for 2 days. Jerry drove. I sat in the passenger seat of that black Mercedes and looked out the window at America rolling by. The flat plains of the Midwest, the rise of the mountains, the big open sky of Montana, and I thought about all the things I wanted to say to my son. We didn't talk much, Jerry and I. 11 years of silence doesn't dissolve overnight. But somewhere in Nebraska, Jerry said, "I'm sorry I didn't come to Eleanor's funeral, Thomas." I looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. He said, "I was too proud. It was stupid. I've regretted it every day." I said, "We can talk about all of that later, Jerry." He nodded. Later was enough. It was a start. We arrived at Paul Acker's retreat on a Saturday morning. It was a beautiful place, rustic buildings nestled in a wide pine valley, with a river running through it and mountains on 3 sides. The kind of place that felt like the world had turned down its volume. Paul Acker met us at the gate. He was a big man, gentle-mannered, with kind eyes. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Mr. Whitmore, your son talks about you. He said you'd never stop looking." I couldn't speak for a moment. Then Paul said, "He's by the river. He asked to meet you there." I walked alone, down a narrow dirt path through the pine trees, with the sound of the river getting louder, and the morning light coming through the branches in long gold columns. And then I saw him. He was sitting on a rock at the water's edge with his back to me. He was thinner than I remembered, and his hair was longer. He was wearing a simple blue flannel shirt and jeans and boots. He had a small stone in his hand, and he was turning it over and over, the way he used to do as a boy when he was thinking hard. I stopped walking. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 10 seconds, maybe a minute. Time felt like it had stopped caring about itself. Then Michael turned around, and I saw his face. He looked like his mother. He had always looked like Eleanor, especially around the eyes. And right then, standing there with his eyes full of something between fear and hope and 4 years of lost time. He looked so much like her that my chest broke open like a dam. He said, "Dad," and I said, "Michael," and then neither of us said anything for a while, because there are moments in life that words are too small for, and you have to let them be what they are. I walked to him and I put my arms around my son, and he grabbed onto me the way Oliver must have grabbed onto him when he was a baby, like I was the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning. He was crying. I was crying. The river kept going, indifferent and beautiful. Finally Michael pulled back and looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad, I'm so sorry." I shook my head. I held his face in my hands, this face I had thought I might never see again, and I said, "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. Do you understand me?" He didn't look convinced. I said, "You're alive. That's all I ever needed." We talked for a long time by that river. Michael told me everything. The full truth of his marriage, the financial stress, the arguments about priorities, the growing distance between him and Sandra in the months before the trip. He told me about the argument the night before he went running. He told me about the fear that had kept him in Montana, even as his memory returned. And then he said something that surprised me. He said, "I heard about Derek." I was quiet. He said, "Uncle Jerry told me, about 6 months ago." He paused. "I can't blame her, Dad. I know that's probably strange to hear." I said, "It's not my place to blame anyone." Michael smiled. Just a small, sad smile. "You sound like Mom." I had to look away for a second. Then he said, "What I'm scared of, Dad, what I've been scared of for 2 years, is Oliver. Sandra can make her choices, but Oliver is my son, and I've missed 4 years of his life. I don't know if he even remembers me." I said, "He's 7 years old now." Michael closed his eyes. I said, "And I'll tell you something. Sandra never threw away your pictures. Oliver has a photograph of you by his bed. I know because Mrs. Patterson, the woman from church, she's still friendly with Sandra, and she told me." Michael opened his eyes. I said, "That boy knows who his father is." Something shifted in my son's face, like a light coming on behind a window that had been dark for a very long time. Michael came home 3 weeks later. "I want to tell you about the day Sandra found out, because this is where the story turns, and where the family reckoning began. Jerry made the calls. He called Sandra first. He called Daniel. He told them what he had told me, everything, from the beginning. The hospital in Montana, the amnesia, the slow recovery, all of it. Sandra's reaction, Jerry told me afterward, was complicated. First there was shock, then tears, then, and this is the part that tells you a great deal about people, then there was a long, long silence. Then Sandra said, "Does Michael know about Derek?" Jerry said, "Yes." Another silence. Then she said, "Oh God." Daniel's reaction was different. He went very quiet on the phone, and then he said, "You're telling me my brother was alive this whole time and I didn't know?" Jerry said, "Yes." Daniel said, "How did you find him? How did you? Why were you the one who?" And then it hit him. The whole weight of it. The fact that he, Daniel, had told me to give up, had told me to be realistic, had told me Michael would not want me to keep searching, had looked at me across that dinner table with patient, tired pity, while Michael was alive in Montana, turning a stone over and over in his hands, remembering Oliver's name. Part 13. The confrontation the day Michael arrived home. I mean really home, in Pennsylvania, back in the town where he grew up. I opened my front door and saw him standing on my porch with a bag over his shoulder, and I simply could not believe the grace of it. I fed him. I made chicken soup from Eleanor's recipe, and he ate 2 bowls and said it tasted exactly like he remembered. We sat at the kitchen table and talked until midnight, just the 2 of us. The next day, Sandra came. She came without Derek, which I thought was wise. She stood in my living room and looked at Michael, like she was trying to decide if he was real. Michael stood up when she came in. They looked at each other for a long time. I left the room. I don't know everything they said to each other. That was their conversation, not mine. But I heard enough through the thin walls of that old house. I heard Sandra crying. I heard Michael's voice, low and steady, saying, "I'm not here to disrupt your life, Sandra. I just want to know my son." I heard Sandra say, "I thought you were dead, Michael. I thought," and Michael said, "I know." They talked for almost 2 hours. I sat in the kitchen and drank tea and thought about Elinor, and how she would have handled this calmly, I knew. Wisely, she always knew what a room needed. When Sandra came out to the kitchen to find me, her eyes were red. She sat down across from me at the table. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Thomas." I looked at her. She said, "I'm so sorry." I said, "Sandra." She said, "No. Please, let me." She pressed her hands flat on the table. I stopped calling. I stopped bringing Oliver. Derek I was just trying to survive. But I should have you never stopped believing. You were right, and we all. She stopped herself. Her voice was cracking. We all let you down. I let you down. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. I said, "You were grieving. You did the best you could." She looked up at me. I said, "What matters now is Oliver knowing his father." And that is all I said. Daniel drove up from Philadelphia 4 days after Michael came home. He pulled into my driveway on a Wednesday evening and sat in his truck for a while before coming to the door. I watched him from the window. He just sat there, looking at the steering wheel, and I could see, even from a distance, that he was having some kind of private battle with himself. When he finally came to the door and I opened it, he looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was still a big man, but something about him had shrunk. Michael was there. They embraced. Michael held on longer than Daniel expected. I could tell, because Daniel stiffened slightly and then relaxed, like a man lowering a shield he'd forgotten he was still carrying. After dinner, Daniel found me on the back porch. He said, "Dad." I said, "Daniel." He said, "I told you to give up on him." I didn't answer. He said, "I sat across from you at that restaurant, and I told you to accept it and be realistic. And all that time," he stopped. He swallowed. "You just kept going, by yourself, with no help from any of us. You were right, and I was wrong, and I was too busy and too—" He pressed his mouth together. "I don't know how to say what I need to say, Dad." I said, "Then just say it." He looked at me. His eyes were wet. He said, "I'm ashamed of myself." The porch was quiet. I said, "Daniel, you were afraid of hoping. I understand that. Your mother's death did something to all of us, and none of us handled it perfectly." He said, "That's too generous." I said, "Maybe, but I'm your father, and that's my prerogative." He almost laughed. It was a wet, broken kind of laugh. "But it was real," he said. "How are you not angry at me?" I thought about it. I said I was, for a while, sitting in that cabin alone, sending Roy Castillo into the field every month, not hearing from you or Sandra. Yes, I was angry. I was very angry. But anger costs a lot of energy, Daniel, and I needed everything I had left to keep looking. He was quiet. I said, "Your brother's home. That's the only thing that matters to me now." Daniel wiped his eye with the back of his hand, quickly, the way men do when they don't want to be seen. He said, "I want to help with Michael, with whatever he needs, with you." I put my hand on my younger son's shoulder. I said, "Okay, I need to tell you about this separately because it deserves its own moment." Oliver was 7 years old. He had been 3 when Michael disappeared. He had grown up with a photograph by his bed and a mother who, to her credit, even through all her pain, had never told him his father was gone forever. She had told him his father was lost and that people were looking. Children have a way of holding on to things adults have already let go. The morning Sandra brought Oliver to meet Michael, really meet him, face to face, in my living room, I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and I watched. Michael was sitting on the couch. He was nervous. I had never seen my son that nervous, not even at his wedding. Oliver came through the front door holding Sandra's hand. He was a small boy. Oliver, dark hair like Michael, serious eyes like Eleanor. He looked across the room and saw Michael. Michael said, very softly, "Hey, buddy." Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad," like he was checking, like he had asked this question in his prayers enough times that saying it out loud felt like the most important test of his life. Michael said, "Yeah, it's me. I'm here." And Oliver crossed that room in 3 seconds flat and climbed into his father's arms. And Michael held him and closed his eyes. And I had to go to the kitchen and stand at the sink and look out the window for a long time, because some things are too sacred to watch and too beautiful to look away from. And I was a man who had spent 4 years carrying a photograph of my son's laugh, and all I could think in that moment was, "Eleanor, you should have seen this. It has been 7 months now since Michael came home. He is getting better, slowly. He is working with a doctor who specializes in trauma and memory. He is rebuilding his relationship with Oliver, 1 weekend at a time. Sandra and Derek have separated not because of Michael, she says, but because something in her woke up when Michael came back, some truth she'd been avoiding. I believe her. People's hearts are complicated things. Jerry and I have been talking every Sunday. Just 2 old brothers on the phone, slowly building a bridge back across 11 years of silence. It is slow work. But bridges don't appear overnight. You lay 1 plank at a time. Daniel drives up once a month now. He helps with repairs around the house. He brought Michael a new jacket last time and watched old football games with him and sat at my kitchen table eating soup and laughing at something Michael said. And I looked at my 2 sons together in that kitchen, the kitchen where I dropped my coffee cup the morning everything ended, and I thought, we made it. Somehow we made it. Now let me say what I believe this story means, because I am an old man, and old men are supposed to have something worth saying when all the drama is done. Here is what I know. Hope is not foolishness. People will tell you to be realistic. They will look at you with kind eyes and tell you that it's time to accept, to move on, to let go. Sometimes they are right, but sometimes the most powerful thing a human being can do is refuse. Not out of stubbornness, not out of denial, but out of love that has decided it will not be argued out of itself. I kept looking for my son because I am his father. That is the whole reason. And being his father was the one job I was given in this life that I refused to quit. And this is what I want to say to any family member who is watching this, who has drifted away from someone who needed you, who has called a grieving person unrealistic, who has let pride, or busyness, or fear build a wall between you and someone you love. The walls we build don't protect us. They just give us somewhere to stand when we realize what we've missed. Jerry missed 11 years of our brotherhood because of an old argument about money. An argument that neither of us can fully even remember the details of anymore. 11 years of birthdays and funerals and grandchildren and Sunday phone calls gone, because 2 stubborn men decided pride was worth more than love. Sandra pushed me away in her grief, and I understand it. But I also know that my grandson grew up for 4 years with less of his grandfather than he deserved, because grief sometimes makes us selfish without even knowing it. Daniel told me to be realistic. Daniel, who I raised, who I drove to baseball practice and helped with his college applications and lent money to when he was just starting out. He looked at his grieving father and gave up before his father did. I am not telling this to punish them. I love my sons. I love Sandra. I even love Jerry, the old stubborn fool. I'm telling this because I want you, watching this right now, to think about someone in your life you have quietly given up on. Someone you have told yourself is too much trouble, or too far gone, or a problem you can't afford to keep carrying. Don't give up on them. Make the call. Drive the distance. Sit in the gravel if you have to. Because the day my estranged brother pulled up in a black Mercedes on a gravel road in North Carolina and said, "Get in the car, Thomas. I know where Michael is," that was not the miracle. The miracle was that I was still there to get in. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, someone you've lost touch with, someone you need to call, then please take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Every week, we share stories like this one, real, human, honest stories about the things that matter most. Hit that subscribe button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, it's never too late to make the call.